It's a Saturday evening in the winter of 1944. A cold wind moves across the plains of Kansas, whispering through the wire of a camp whose floodlights hum against the dark. Inside the mess hall, the air smells of sawdust and burnt coffee. A group of men in faded field gray uniforms shuffle in, shoulders hunched, breath fogging in the dim light. Across their backs, stenciled in white, the letters PW, Prisoner of War. A projector coughs to life. The first beam of light cuts through cigarette smoke, trembling across a wrinkled bedsheet tacked to the wall. On it, not the front lines, not Stalingrad, not bombers above the Ruhr, but a smiling cowboy framed against a painted sky. The film's score crackles through tin speakers. Somewhere in the back row, a guard leans against the doorframe, arms folded, eyes half on the prisoners, half on the movie. Laughter erupts at a slapstick fall. For a moment, even the barbed wire fades. The men forget the war outside, the surrender papers signed by their captains, the train rides across the ocean. They are only an audience now, caught in the glow of a Hollywood dream. Minutes later, the reel burns, leaving a hole of white light on the screen. Groans fill the hall. Someone shouts in German to fix it. Another voice laughs. The projectionist, an American private with grease on his hands, threads the reel again, and the dream resumes. Behind the screen, the world remains divided by barbed wire and ideology. But inside this hall, for 90 fragile minutes, enemies share a single story. And that simple act, showing a film to the defeated, would become one of the quietest, strangest experiments of the Second World War. By 1942, America was a country at total war, yet one curiously unprepared for the human cargo that would soon arrive on its shores. Across the Atlantic, the Allies were capturing tens of thousands of German soldiers in North Africa. At first, British camps overflowed. The solution was audacious: ship thousands of prisoners across the ocean to the United States, where space, food, and relative security abounded. Between 1942 and 1946, more than 425,000 German POWs would be held in over 660 main and branch camps scattered across the American interior. From the pine forests of Louisiana to the wheat fields of Nebraska, the deserts of Arizona, and the farmlands of Wisconsin, they were guarded not by hardened combat veterans, but often by men too old or too young for the front. A mix of citizen soldiers and reserve officers, some barely trained for the psychology of captivity. The U.S. War Department, guided by the 1929 Geneva Convention, knew these men were not criminals. They were enemy soldiers who had surrendered, to be fed, housed, and treated with dignity. In return, they could be put to work in non-military labor. Fields needed tending. Factories needed hands. America's wartime labor shortage turned German POWs into a quiet workforce under guard towers and open skies. Camps took on a rhythm of containment and routine. Reveille at dawn, breakfast, powdered eggs, canned fruit, coffee. Work detachments boarded trucks, bound for orchards, sawmills, or canning plants. Back inside the wire, there were barracks libraries, makeshift chapels, soccer pitches carved from clay, and weekly letters home via the International Red Cross. Entertainment, diversion, became a matter of policy. The War Department understood boredom as a dangerous enemy. A restless man could turn disruptive, an occupied man cooperative. And so the Army's Special Services branch, alongside the YMCA and the National Catholic Community Service, began sending crates of books, sports gear, and eventually, reels of film to the camps. Motion pictures had already become part of the American soldier's routine. A morale tool, a brief escape. The same logic extended to prisoners. If movies could calm troops, they could also stabilize captives. By late 1943, many camps had set aside 1 or 2 nights a week for screenings. In some, the mess hall doubled as a theater. In others, a tent or even a barn was converted. POWs built benches, stretched sheets for screens, and scrounged wood for risers. In larger compounds like Camp Swift, Texas, or Camp Atterbury, Indiana, attendance could reach hundreds. The selection was eclectic: comedies, Westerns, musicals, romances, whatever the Army Film Service had in circulation. Silent films appeared where projectors lacked sound. Later, subtitled prints were distributed when German translators were available. A few prisoners who had once worked as projectionists in Germany volunteered to operate the machines, often under guard supervision. Yet the experience was never neutral. When a Western unspooled across the screen, showing frontier justice and wide-open freedom, it carried unintended messages. To men confined behind fences, the sight of Americans laughing in theaters, driving cars, or singing in Technicolor could be a shock. For others, it was a revelation. A first look into the world they had been told was decadent or false. In the early months, there were frictions. Some prisoners balked at propaganda shorts or patriotic films. Others whispered that watching Allied movies betrayed their comrades still fighting. But over time, curiosity won. Camp commanders noticed. Movie nights reduced fights, eased tensions, and brought order. Reports from Fort Robinson and Camp Aliceville noted that attendance soared whenever the program was announced, even among the most hard-bitten sergeants. The U.S. military's interest, however, went beyond morale. Hidden beneath the surface of these screenings lay a deeper psychological experiment. Could exposure to American culture reshape the enemy's perception of democracy itself? In late 1943, Washington's Special Projects Division began drafting what it called intellectual diversion, cultural programming aimed not merely to entertain, but to educate. Films, music, and lectures would quietly challenge Nazi ideology without overt coercion. This approach, later known as re-education, walked a delicate line. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners could not be politically indoctrinated, but they could be shown ideas, presented indirectly, through images and stories. Hollywood became an unlikely instrument in this quiet campaign. While the Army never screened explicitly propagandistic films in most camps, it did favor works that reflected democratic ideals or moral complexity. American comedies with empathy, courtroom dramas, and stories where individual conscience triumphed over blind obedience. Among the most circulated titles were It Happened One Night, 1934, Stagecoach, 1939, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, 1939, and The Grapes of Wrath, 1940. For many POWs, these were the first glimpses of an America that felt human, flawed, struggling, but free. Inside the camps, this exposure created unlikely ambassadors. Some prisoners began discussing themes after screenings: justice, freedom, and the power of individual will. Others dismissed them as enemy propaganda. But even disagreement meant engagement, a small intellectual victory for those who sought to weaken totalitarian habits of thought. As the war stretched on, film reels arrived more regularly. In some camps, prisoners even requested specific genres: comedies to break monotony, adventure films to feel alive. Camp newspapers, even printed by prisoners with U.S. oversight, published cinema schedules for the week. Attendance was voluntary, but few stayed away. Still, not every camp was equal. Conditions varied. In some southern facilities, segregationist attitudes or poor discipline among guards led to tension and isolation. Elsewhere, like in the Midwest, a degree of mutual respect grew between captors and captives. The film nights reflected this spectrum. Where trust existed, the atmosphere resembled that opening scene: laughter, shared space, a temporary easing of divisions. Where mistrust lingered, screenings were tense. Watched over by armed guards, the laughter stifled. Yet everywhere, the same paradox persisted. The enemy was learning about freedom through the very culture of his captors. And as the lights dimmed each week, those images, the dance steps, the open roads, the defiant speeches, began to work on memory and imagination alike. But this cultural exchange was not without calculation. Behind the flickering reels lay careful supervision, government policy, and the fine print of the Geneva Convention. By early 1944, the U.S. Army had moved from simple containment toward something more deliberate, a long-term psychological and educational plan. The war's outcome was tilting toward Allied victory, but the question loomed. What kind of Germany would emerge afterward? The Office of the Provost Marshal General, OPMG, responsible for prisoner affairs, began framing captivity not as punishment, but as preparation. They called it reorientation. The term sounded neutral, even humane, but its intent was strategic: to expose enemy soldiers to the moral contrast between totalitarianism and democracy, through experience, not lectures. Under the Special Projects Division, the Army enlisted educators, linguists, and psychologists to develop cultural materials suited to German audiences. Books, pamphlets, and films were central to the plan, yet they had to be handled with care. The 1929 Geneva Convention strictly forbade coercive propaganda. Anything overtly political could provoke outrage or complaints through the Red Cross. The solution was subtlety. Instead of anti-Nazi tracts, camps received films embodying democratic virtues indirectly. Casablanca, for example, portrayed resistance to tyranny without naming regimes. Art Town offered moral reflection. Comedies with strong individual characters, like Arsenic and Old Lace, suggested the vitality of personal conscience. This was no coincidence. Each film was screened, catalogued, and approved by the War Department's Bureau of Public Services and the Office of War Information before entering the camp circuit. Reels traveled in locked metal cases, checked out like library items. Projection logs recorded attendance, feedback, and any disturbances. In practice, the screenings became complex cultural negotiations. Commanders balanced two priorities: discipline and diplomacy. A film that offended Nazi hardliners could ignite boycotts or even sabotage. One too tame might bore the moderates and erode engagement. Each camp developed its own informal censor board, usually a combination of U.S. officers and selected POW representatives. The physical logistics were no less intricate. Projectors, 16mm Bell and Howell units, arrived with manuals, spare bulbs, and carbon rods. Electricity was rationed, so screenings often aligned with generator schedules. In some barracks, blackout curtains were stitched from burlap sacks to block the glow from guard towers. POW carpenters built folding chairs, platforms, and speaker stands from scrap wood. Attendance was officially voluntary, but socially magnetic. For many, movie night was the highlight of captivity. The hall filled early. Men swapped cigarettes for front seats. Some smuggled bread crusts or dried fruit as snacks, a faint echo of civilian life. Guards took positions at exits, rifles slung but relaxed. Once the lights dimmed, silence fell. A fragile truce between uniform and uniform. The YMCA, acting as an intermediary under international agreement, also supplied foreign films when available. Neutral productions from Sweden or Switzerland, and even older German classics from the UFA archives when permitted. This mix preserved dignity. Prisoners could see their own cultural icons alongside Hollywood stars. The message was implicit. Germany's cultural worth was not erased, only recontextualized. By 1944, these programs expanded into camp education departments, which hosted lectures, art exhibitions, and discussion circles after screenings. Some POWs began forming theater groups, producing plays in German or English. Others volunteered to write short essays reflecting on the films, a quiet revolution in self-expression under confinement. Not all guards approved. A few saw the activities as pampering the enemy. Letters from rural locals sometimes complained, "They get movies while our boys die overseas." But the War Department insisted. Order was cheaper than chaos. Reports proved it. Where film programs thrived, incidents of escape, violence, or resistance dropped dramatically. Camps like Aliceville, Alabama, and Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, became showcases. American officers there reported unprecedented calm and even cooperation. At Aliceville, after a screening of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, a group of prisoners asked for English dictionaries to understand the dialogue better. Later, some organized voluntary language classes. The guards took note. However, Cultural exposure also disrupted the prisoners' inner hierarchies. Within the barracks, ideological factions had formed early on. Blacks, Die Schwarzen, referring to staunch Nazis, and Greys or Whites for moderates or skeptics. For the hardliners, every American film, every English lesson was betrayal. They branded participants traitors, and sometimes enforced discipline through intimidation or covert beatings. As the war neared its end, these divisions deepened. Films that emphasized freedom, compassion, or interracial camaraderie, even subtly, threatened Nazi purists. In some camps, U.S. officers used that very friction to identify unreconstructed extremists. Those who refused participation were later transferred to high-security facilities like Camp Alva, Oklahoma, known as the Hardcore Camp. By contrast, moderate POWs found in the screenings a fragile sense of normalcy. Watching American crowds cheer, lovers reunite, or music fill a dance hall reminded them of what life beyond ideology could feel like. The experience did not erase guilt or allegiance overnight, but it seeded comparison between what they were told and what they saw. As one former prisoner later wrote, "We began to see the faces of the enemy as human. That was the beginning of change." In the dim light of those makeshift theaters, propaganda met empathy, and control met curiosity. What began as policy became personal, a dialogue carried out through images, laughter, and the hum of a projector. And within that dialogue, the U.S. discovered something quietly powerful. Culture could pacify without force, and cinema could reach where ideology could not. But film, like war, has its consequences. Soon, those same screens would illuminate something darker. The breaking point where laughter collided with loyalty, and the boundaries of obedience would be tested inside the wire. The human angle. Escaping without leaving. Inside every camp, there came a moment, after supper, before lights out, when the noise of the day dissolved into the hum of a generator. A film began to roll, and for the prisoners, it was the one time the wire disappeared. To men who had crossed deserts, fought in Tunisia, or crawled through bombed villages in Italy, the flicker of the screen was almost sacred. The faces of Clark Gable, Jimmy Stewart, and Ginger Rogers became portals to a world untouched by orders, ranks, or salutes. For a few hours they weren't enemy aliens. They were simply men watching shadows dance. The psychology was simple but profound. Movies reminded them of rhythm, laughter, romance, music. The emotional colors absent from military life. Prisoners later recalled how, during screenings of comedies, it felt as if the air in the barracks became human again. When the screen went dark, reality snapped back, but something lingered. A sensation of having lived, not merely existed. Letters intercepted by censors reflected this transformation. "We watched a film with Americans laughing," one POW wrote to his family in 1944. "It made me forget for 2 hours that I was not free." The letter never left the camp, but the sentiment was recorded in U.S. reports as evidence of positive adjustment. Not everyone surrendered easily to that warmth. For hardline prisoners, laughter in captivity felt like weakness. They muttered during the credits, accusing others of betraying the fatherland. Yet even they watched, because the films, like curiosity itself, were irresistible. And so, in that half-light, the first small cracks appeared, not in loyalty, but in perspective. To witness Americans as human, not monsters, was itself subversive. The tactical angle. Control through comfort. The War Department's interest in cinema was not purely sentimental. Every minute of calm behind the wire was a victory of administration. Camp commandants learned early that boredom was the true enemy. Idle men plotted, argued, and occasionally fought. By contrast, a man with a schedule, work, mail, and film, was manageable. The screenings became psychological pressure valves, transforming tension into silence. An Army report from 1944 noted, "In facilities maintaining regular entertainment programs, incidents of disorder have declined by over 50%. For administrators managing thousands of enemy soldiers, that statistic was gold. The system was efficient. Movies required no translator, no ideology. They occupied minds and time. A night of laughter cost far less than a riot squad. One colonel described it bluntly. A projector is worth a platoon of guards. The American guards understood it intuitively. Many were farmers, teachers, or mechanics drafted into uniform. They had no personal quarrel with the men they watched over. Sitting in the same hall during screenings created a subtle equilibrium, a shared silent recognition of common humanity. Yet the balance was fragile. One spark, an argument, a misinterpreted scene, a political comment, could reignite hostility. Camp instructions were clear. Allow enjoyment, forbid debate. But conversation was inevitable. After Mrs. Miniver, a film about British civilians enduring the Blitz, several POWs reportedly asked guards, "Is this what your families suffered?" For the first time, empathy breached ideology. American officials took note. Cultural exposure was working. Not as re-education by force, but by contrast. A film could show what freedom felt like without needing to preach it. Still, not all saw it as progress. Some U.S. officers, especially those from combat zones, viewed the screenings as undeserved luxury. "We're giving them Hollywood while ours die in Europe," one wrote bitterly in his diary. But for Washington, the calculus was strategic. Calm prisoners meant saved resources, and possibly future allies. In this balance between mercy and management, film became both a weapon and a bomb. The technological angle, the machine and the light. The mechanics of the movie night were as intricate as the psychology. Behind each reel lay a miniature logistics operation, one that mirrored the efficiency of the Army itself. At the heart of it stood the 16mm Bell & Howell Filmo projector, sturdy, metallic, humming with the faint smell of ozone. Each weighed about 20 pounds and could run off portable generators. The Army Film Service shipped thousands of these units across the country, packed in wooden crates with spools of approved content. Prisoners with technical backgrounds often volunteered as operators. They cleaned lenses, mended torn film with tape, and timed the reels by stopwatch. For many, this mechanical ritual became a craft, a link between their old lives and captivity. Engineers, electricians, even former cameramen from UFA studios found solace in the precision of light and film. The projectors were placed on makeshift platforms in mess halls. Chairs creaked, boots scuffed, and the first click of the shutters summoned silence. The soundtracks, often faint through tin speakers, filled the room like static dreams. Some camps lacked proper sound systems, relying on subtitles or even translators reading aloud. Others improvised, attaching car batteries to amplify volume. The flicker wasn't perfect. The reels sometimes broke mid-scene, throwing white fire across faces, but to the men inside, it was enough. In Camp Concordia, Kansas, one POW reportedly carved a wooden frame to stabilize the projector against vibration. His name, recorded in camp files, was Otto H., a mechanical engineer from Hamburg. After the war, he returned to Germany and worked in cinema equipment manufacturing. His technical drawings from the camp still survive. Notes on lens calibration, written on U.S. Army stationery. These small details, the hum of machinery, the smell of celluloid, bridged the mechanical and the emotional. The projector wasn't merely a device, it was the camp's heartbeat. When the light hit the sheet, eyes lifted together, captors and captives, into a shared illusion. The very technology born of modernity, often used for propaganda or destruction, became in that moment a tool of fragile peace. And so through light, sound, and metal, a new kind of front line appeared, not on battlefields, but within perception itself. Each of these perspectives, human, tactical, technological, revealed something deeper than mere entertainment. The screen had become a mirror of both captivity and freedom. But the story doesn't end with calm, for beneath that quiet glow, ideological fractures began to widen. Friendships formed, loyalties blurred, and cinema's power began to unsettle as much as it soothed. The ideological angle, when film met faith. Inside the barbed wire, authority had layers. The U.S. guards controlled the perimeter, but inside, German order persisted. Prisoners organized their own councils, mess committees, and even cultural officers. Among them, ideological enforcers, Die Schwarzen, guarded Nazi orthodoxy like priests guarding a creed. To them, the cinema nights were dangerous. A flickering reel could undo years of indoctrination. It wasn't the story itself that threatened them, it was doubt. To see an American courtroom where a lone man defied corruption and Mr. Smith goes to Washington, or to watch ordinary citizens choose conscience over obedience, stirred something far more subversive than propaganda. Comparison. Reports from Camp Aliceville describe whispered arguments in the barracks after certain films. A sergeant accused another of thinking like a Democrat. One prisoner, who translated the dialogue for others, was branded a verräter, traitor, and later transferred to isolation for his safety. Commanders walked a careful line. The Geneva Convention forbade political re-education, yet the Army's Special Projects Division quietly encouraged exposure. Each camp commandant had to judge where tolerance ended and provocation began. One officer wrote in a 1945 memo, "We cannot tell them what to think, but we can let them see." That visual exposure did more than any pamphlet could. Some prisoners began sketching American scenes they saw in films. City skylines, cars, baseball diamonds. A few started English study groups, using movie dialogue as practice. Others, still loyal to Nazi ideals, tore those sketches up in anger. The camp became a microcosm of a future Germany. Divided, uncertain, debating its soul in a mess hall turned theater. The enemy and moral angle. The ethics of escape. The question haunted both sides. Was it right to give comfort to the enemy? For American civilians who glimpsed POWs watching films or buying ice cream from mobile canteens, it seemed absurd. Newspapers occasionally published letters from outraged citizens. Our boys die in France while theirs watch Hollywood. Yet behind the moral tension lay military pragmatism and, unintentionally, moral revelation. The act of allowing pleasure to a defeated enemy challenged the logic of total war. It suggested that America fought differently, not to annihilate, but to restore. For the prisoners, too, morality blurred. Many wrestled with guilt as laughter filled the hall. Some couldn't shake the image of destroyed German cities or starving families back home. To laugh at American humor felt disloyal, even sinful. But to resist was pointless. Laughter escaped them anyway. Guards observed this contradiction with quiet fascination. In one report from Camp Swift, a lieutenant noted that men who seldom smiled in the yard roared with laughter during the Philadelphia story. When the lights came up, those same men stood silently, faces blank again, the moment buried. This oscillation between joy and shame was its own kind of psychological re-education. It humanized both sides, but it also revealed the scars ideology leaves. How even simple happiness could feel treasonous after years of indoctrination. The ethics extended to the projection booth itself. American operators were instructed to cut certain newsreels, especially footage of Allied victories or concentration camp liberations, to avoid humiliation or unrest. But rumors spread nonetheless. "The Americans hide our defeats from us," one prisoner said bitterly. In truth, they hid the full horror, not to protect pride, but to preserve order. That restraint, too, carried moral weight. The war was being fought to the death overseas, yet inside the wire, the victors practiced mercy. The screen, in its soft glow, became proof of that difference. The cultural exchange angle, cowboys, swing, and memory by 1945. The camp cinemas had become crossroads of culture. The Western was the favorite. For Germans raised on rigid discipline, the cowboy's independence, his moral code guided by choice, not decree, was intoxicating. After a screening of Stagecoach, one prisoner reportedly said, "I had never seen a man so free." Music seeped in too. From the speakers came jazz, swing, and the syncopated rhythm that Hitler's regime had outlawed as degenerate. In the camps, it became an anthem of forbidden pleasure. Guards sometimes allowed small dances after musical films. Prisoners clapped along, awkward at first, then exuberant. Cultural osmosis worked both ways. American guards, curious about their captives, began attending German theater performances or folk concerts organized inside the wire. A strange respect grew. Not friendship, but recognition. One GI wrote home, "They look just like us, only thinner." As surrender loomed in 1945, those evenings took on a bittersweet tone. The prisoners knew their nation was collapsing. The films became elegies for a world they had never known. Free, vibrant, unbroken by propaganda. Some began collecting stills from American magazines distributed in camp libraries. Others cut out photographs of actresses or cityscapes, storing them like talismans of another life. When repatriation finally came, they carried those images home. A study conducted in 1946 by the Army's Information Control Division found that many ex-POWs who had spent time in U.S. camps expressed favorable impressions of American life and institutions. Some even returned in later decades as immigrants, citing the humanity they had experienced during captivity. "And the movies," one man added simply. The experiment had worked, though no one called it that aloud. Hollywood, intended as entertainment, had become a quiet ambassador for democracy. Those were the six lenses: human, tactical, technological, ideological, moral, and cultural, each refracting a different truth about light and captivity. Together they reveal how a strip of film could reach deeper than any lecture or rifle. But beneath the laughter and debate, tensions simmered. The more these prisoners glimpsed the world beyond the wire, the sharper the divide became between those ready to accept it and those determined to resist. The stage was set for a confrontation. One reel, one night, would push that fragile balance to its breaking point. It was the summer of 1945. The war in Europe was over, though the Pacific still burned. News traveled slowly inside the camps, carried by rumor and Red Cross bulletins. The surrender of Germany had left a vacuum, not of command, but of meaning. At Camp Aliceville, Alabama, one of the largest German POW facilities in the United States, the nights had grown quieter. The guards no longer expected escapes. The men no longer drilled in secret. But inside the barracks, something new simmered. Tension between those who accepted defeat and those who refused it. The U.S. Army, confident in victory, expanded its educational program. Alongside lectures and English lessons, it approved a film that had stirred debate even among officers, Why We Fight, Frank Capra's wartime documentary series explaining the moral purpose behind the Allied cause. It had been shown to American troops before D-Day. Now, the War Department believed it could serve as a bridge toward understanding. The Geneva Convention forbade overt political indoctrination, but this was no crude propaganda film. It was history, told through maps, narration, and captured German footage. Officials decided it was safe. On a humid evening in June, the mess hall filled with more than 300 prisoners. The air smelled of pine and kerosene. Guards took their positions at the rear. The projector rattled to life, its beam cutting through smoke and heat. The opening reel rolled, a calm voice describing the rise of fascism, the invasions of Europe, the crimes committed under the swastika. On-screen flashed the images: stormtroopers, burning cities, camps, and lines of refugees. The narrator's tone was measured, almost sorrowful. In the front rows, some prisoners stared in silence. Others whispered angrily. A sergeant muttered, "Lügen film, film of lies." His voice carried. A few heads turned. When footage appeared of Nazi rallies, arms raised in unison, the hall filled with murmurs. For some, it was nostalgia. For others, shame. Then the narrator's voice cut through again. "This is the world they made, and the world we must end." That sentence hit like a blow. A young guard later recalled, "You could feel the air change." In the back corner, a group of hardliners stood abruptly. Their leader, a decorated non-commissioned officer named Kurt W., shouted, "Turn it off! This is American poison." The guard nearest him tightened his grip on his rifle but hesitated. The projector whirred on. The commandant had anticipated trouble. He stepped forward, calm, his southern accent steady. "You are free to leave the hall," he said. "No one is forced to watch." A long pause. Then chairs scraped. A dozen men walked out, boots striking the floor in deliberate rhythm. But most stayed. What followed was a silence deeper than before. The kind that fills after belief cracks but before truth takes root. On the screen came footage from liberated France. Children waving. Cities rebuilding, Allied soldiers distributing food. The contrast was unbearable for some. One prisoner whispered, "They don't look like barbarians." Another answered, "That's the trick." When the final reel ended, the hall did not applaud. The light faded, leaving only the hum of the projector fan. Guards exchanged glances. Then quietly, a single prisoner began to clap. Others followed hesitantly, a slow, uneven rhythm. The hardliners who had left were already outside, waiting. Later that night, words were exchanged in the barracks. Shouts in German echoed through the compound. A fight broke out near the washroom. Fists, not weapons. And by morning, 2 men had been hospitalized, one with a broken jaw. In the official report, the cause was listed as personal dispute. But every man in the camp knew it began with a film. The aftermath spread quickly. Hardliners accused the Americans of brainwashing. Moderates, for the first time, began speaking openly, not of surrender, but of conscience. The internal order the prisoners had maintained since capture, the shadow government of sergeants and Nazi loyalists, began to fracture. For the Americans, this was both triumph and risk. Re-education through culture had worked, perhaps too well. A week later, the same camp held another screening. It's a Wonderful Life. Newly released, imported under special permission. This time the theme was not war, but redemption. A man discovering the worth of his own existence. The guards expected calm. Instead, emotion filled the room. Some prisoners wept silently. A few laughed through tears. When the film ended, an older sergeant stood and said softly, "If this is America, we never knew it." His words were recorded in the camp's daily log, a single line under "Remarks, emotional response observed." The shift was unmistakable. For months, officers had measured discipline by metrics, escape attempts, labor performance, cleanliness. Now something intangible had changed. The camp felt both lighter and more unstable. Aliceville was not alone. Across the U.S., similar incidents unfolded. At Camp McCain, Mississippi, a group of prisoners refused to watch any American films, claiming it softened willpower. In contrast, at Camp Concordia, Kansas, POWs requested a repeat showing of The Grapes of Wrath, saying they wished to understand the American farmer. The command structure of the Wehrmacht had collapsed, but inside these microcosms, the battle for identity continued, not with rifles, but with reels. That summer, American authorities recognized the dual edge of their experiment. They had succeeded in bringing humanity into captivity. But humanity, once awakened, could not be neatly controlled. The projector, once a harmless tool, had become a catalyst. And the climax of that cultural war, the moment when image, ideology, and emotion collided completely, was still to come. Because one night, in another camp, a reel of film would push everything past the point of recovery. The date was September 8, 1945. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. Victory banners hung in every American town. But in the POW camps still awaiting repatriation, unease replaced relief. The prisoners were alive, but they were ghosts of an army that no longer existed. At Camp McCain, Mississippi, the mood was restless. Weeks of idleness had frayed tempers. The men knew they would soon board ships home, yet none knew what home meant anymore. Germany was rubble, families scattered. Letters trickled in describing cities flattened, women and children displaced. That night, the camp announced a special showing. part of the new Cultural Understanding program introduced after Germany's surrender. The film, The Battle of Russia, another in Capra's Why We Fight series, chronicling the Eastern Front and the Soviet struggle against Hitler. The choice was deliberate and dangerous. Many of the men in the hall had fought on that very front. For them, Russia was not an ally, but a nightmare. Frozen fields, partisan ambushes, the dead unburied in the snow. Still, curiosity drew them in. The mess hall filled early. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the smell of damp uniforms. The projectionist checked the reels twice. Guards stood quietly at the exits. The film began with sweeping orchestral music, followed by narration in solemn tones. Maps appeared, arrows advancing, cities falling. Then came the images. German troops marching through snow, burning villages, Soviet soldiers digging graves. At first, silence. Then, low voices, murmurs of disbelief. Lies, someone whispered. This is Bolshevik garbage. When the footage showed German atrocities, executions, civilians fleeing, bombed churches, a ripple of anger moved through the hall. One man shouted, "We never did this!" Another rose to his feet, trembling, fists clenched. The guard sergeant, a former schoolteacher from Iowa, stepped forward. "Sit down," he said quietly. "It's just a film." But for the men in that room, it wasn't. It was accusation. It was judgment. The projector kept rolling. Then came the scene that broke it. On screen, a German officer overseeing a mass shooting. The narrator's voice, calm, precise, called it the policy of terror. A chair crashed backward. The man who had shouted earlier, a corporal from Bavaria, stormed toward the projector, shouting, "Stop this filth!" Another prisoner grabbed him, trying to pull him back. They struggled. The beam wavered. The film flared white. Guards rushed forward. Voices in English and German collided. In the confusion, someone hit the lights. The room erupted, not in riot, but in chaos. Yelling, shoving, boots scraping the floor. When order was finally restored, 2 prisoners were bleeding, and the projector's reel was torn from its spool, hanging like a disemboweled organ. The corporal sat against the wall, hands shaking, whispering the same word over and over, "Lüge," lie. The screening was never finished. The report filed that night described the incident as disturbance during cultural program. But those who were there knew something far deeper had happened. The illusion that cinema could remain apolitical had died. In the following days, the camp divided. Roughly half the prisoners demanded that enemy propaganda be stopped. Others, quieter, introspective, began to question what they had seen. One asked an American interpreter, "Is it true?" The interpreter hesitated, then nodded. "Some of it," he said. "Enough of it." That answer lingered. Enough of it. For some, it was unbearable. For others, it was the first step toward reckoning. The U.S. officers debated whether to continue film screenings at all. Some argued the experiment had failed. Others insisted it had finally succeeded. That confrontation, not comfort, was the real re-education. A week later, in a small gesture of reconciliation, the camp showed a comedy, The Miracle of Morgan's Creek. The story of chaos, confusion, and eventual redemption felt oddly fitting. The audience laughed again, hesitantly at first, then freely. But beneath that laughter ran a tremor of change. The prisoners who had once enforced silence now avoided the spotlight. Their authority, rooted in fear and ideology, had been shattered by images their own eyes could not unsee. A letter written months later by one of the American officers captured the aftermath best. They came to watch a film about war. They left having seen themselves. The projector gave them a mirror they did not ask for. Across the United States, similar stories unfolded. At Camp Clinton, Mississippi, a German lieutenant who had mocked the films early on requested a private screening of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. He asked for an English dictionary and watched it 3 times. At Camp Trinidad, Colorado, prisoners requested films about Reconstruction and peace. By late 1945, reports from multiple camps described an attitudinal shift. Quiet, gradual but real. The U.S. Army, reviewing these findings, concluded that exposure to American life and values, even through entertainment, had produced more lasting changes in perception than formal instruction. Yet no one celebrated. The process had been too human, too messy. It had left scars, psychological, moral, and collective. As winter approached, the projectors cooled. Repatriation began. Men folded their few belongings into Red Cross duffels. A shaving kit, a photograph, a folded letter, sometimes a scrap of movie poster torn from the wall. They would soon sail home, not as victors or heroes, but as witnesses to an enemy who had treated them with paradoxical kindness. And long after the camps emptied, long after the screens dimmed, the question would remain: what happens when the light that once entertained you begins to judge you? The films had done what armies could not. They had crossed the border between ideology and conscience. But now came the quieter, heavier phase of this story, the aftermath, the years when these memories of celluloid and captivity followed the men back across the Atlantic. When the last reels were packed away and the final screenings logged, the United States faced a new logistical problem: sending 425,000 German prisoners home. By early 1946, camps across the Midwest and South were closing in waves. Trains rolled north and east, carrying columns of men in gray uniforms marked PW. At ports like Newport News, Virginia, and Boston Harbor, they boarded Liberty ships under guard, bound for a homeland that barely existed. The official records called it Operation Keel Haul, the vast, methodical repatriation of Axis prisoners. But behind that bureaucratic term lay millions of small reckonings. For some, the war had ended long ago, in a Kansas mess hall, watching it happen one night or stagecoach. For others, it never would. As prisoners disembarked in France and the British zones of occupied Germany, Allied intelligence officers conducted interviews. They expected bitterness. What they found instead was complexity. Reports compiled by the Information Control Division in 1946 described many returning POWs as disciplined, courteous, and surprisingly sympathetic toward democratic ideals. One officer noted, "Their exposure to American conduct, justice, and culture has had a moderating influence not observable in those repatriated from the Eastern Front." The difference was stark. Men returning from Soviet captivity often bore trauma and resentment. Those from America, though humbled, carried different stories: of guards who shared cigarettes, farmers who offered apples, and Saturday nights spent watching motion pictures under a tin roof. To German civilians still starving amid ruins, these tales sounded like fantasy. "They showed you movies?" one woman asked incredulously. "Yes," a former corporal replied. "And for a while, we forgot everything." That forgetting, brief and humane, became one of the most curious legacies of the war. Historians later debated the true impact of those screenings. Some argued they were little more than distraction, a way to keep prisoners docile. But others, particularly post-war sociologists like Eugene Davidson and Klaus Mann, saw in them the beginnings of something subtler: acculturation. The films had not converted the prisoners. They had simply exposed them to a functioning, confident democracy, one that could laugh at itself, question authority, and still hold together. That impression endured. In post-war Germany, surveys of ex-POWs revealed that many who had spent captivity in the United States were less hostile to American occupation and more open to Reconstruction programs like the Marshall Plan. Some even became interpreters or civil administrators. For the Allied forces in the late 1940s, the Army took notice. In internal memos, officers cited the POW film program as a notable success in post-conflict attitudinal rehabilitation. The phrase was clinical, but beneath it lay a moral truth. Empathy had done what ideology could not. At the personal level, the transformation showed in letters and diaries. One former prisoner, Heinrich K., wrote in 1947, "When I saw Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, I thought it was only theater. Now I see it was a lesson. A man can serve his country and still question it. We did not know that was possible. Another remembered the night he laughed during bringing up baby. It was the first time in years I laughed without fear. I think that was when I stopped being a soldier. Not every memory was gentle. A few carried guilt. The memory of their anger, their disbelief during films that mirrored their crimes. The Americans did not beat us, one wrote, but they showed us who we were. Even for the guards, the experience left a mark. Decades later, former American officers interviewed by the Smithsonian recalled the paradox of those years. "It's strange," said Sergeant Bill R. "You start the war hating them, then end up passing them popcorn." As academic evaluations continued, the data spoke quietly but clearly. Camps with consistent cultural programs, books, music, and especially film, reported the lowest rates of violence, illness, and suicide. They also recorded the highest rates of voluntary cooperation. One internal summary stated, "Motion pictures have provided the most effective form of organized recreation. They have reduced hostility and increased general morale among prisoners of war." But beyond the statistics lay something harder to measure: the residue of shared humanity. For many Americans who worked those camps, the war ended not on the day of victory, but on the night they realized the men across the fence were no longer enemies, just exhausted human beings trying to remember laughter. After the last train departed, many camps were dismantled within weeks. Barbed wire was rolled, guard towers dismantled, and fields replanted. In some towns, local children later played on the old campgrounds, unaware that once, their hills had echoed with German voices singing along to swing time. Years later, historians visiting those sites found traces: fragments of film reels buried in the dust, ticket stubs from YMCA screenings, handwritten schedules listing Tuesday, my favorite wife, Saturday, stagecoach. Each relic spoke to the same truth. In the quiet aftermath of total war, the simplest act, sharing a story in the dark, had carried more power than any sermon or speech. Yet the question lingered: did those films truly change minds, or merely momentarily soothe them? To answer that, one must follow those prisoners not just to their ships, but to what they did after the return, in the new Germany being built from ashes. The first ships arrived. In Europe in the spring of 1946, German prisoners stepped off at ports along the English Channel in the North Sea, escorted by British and American officers, then loaded onto trains bound for shattered cities: Hamburg, Frankfurt, Dresden, Cologne. The landscape was unrecognizable, factories gutted, rail lines twisted like broken ribs. In many towns, the only buildings still standing were churches and chimneys. Food was scarce, jobs non-existent, the black market thriving. To men who had spent the war years harvesting peaches in Georgia or repairing fences in Kansas, the contrast was dizzying. They had left order, even kindness, and returned to chaos. Some said the silence of home felt louder than the guards' whistles had ever been. Letters and memoirs from these months reveal a strange dissonance. "America was captivity," wrote one former sergeant, "but it was clean, fair, and predictable. Germany was freedom, but it was dust." The irony was painful. They had longed for home, yet what they found no longer matched their memories. The war was gone, but its ruins remained. Physical, moral, psychological. And so many ex-POWs began to remember the United States not as an enemy, but as a model. They spoke of the kindness of farmers, the fairness of officers, and the decency of the American way of life. Lessons that had arrived not through lectures, but through movies, meals, and mutual respect. In small towns across West Germany, this new mindset began to spread. Former POWs organized reading circles, civic clubs, and even film societies. In 1948, when American occupation authorities reopened cinemas across the Western zones, attendance soared, led by the very generation who had once watched Hollywood under guard. Western films and comedies again filled the screens: Stagecoach, His Girl Friday, Casablanca. To many Germans, these were not foreign propaganda but windows into a moral universe that valued humor, choice, and personal responsibility. The American century had arrived, not through force of arms, but through reels of light remembered from captivity. Sociologists of the 1950s would later call this phenomenon the reorientation effect, the subtle reshaping of attitudes among those who had spent time in democratic nations as prisoners of war. A 1951 University of Heidelberg survey found that ex-POWs from U.S. camps were significantly more supportive of pluralism and free elections than those repatriated from Soviet or Balkan detention. Even the denazification tribunals noticed. When questioned about political beliefs, some POW returnees referenced American fairness. One said, "They showed us they could win without hate." Among them were men who would later play small but symbolic roles in West Germany's reconstruction: teachers, police officers, journalists. A few even joined cultural exchange programs during the 1950s, returning to the United States as visitors. When asked what first changed their view of America, their answers were often the same: the movies in the camp. The influence extended further than politics. In art and literature, the experience of captivity emerged as quiet reflection. German filmmakers of the 1950s, such as Bernhard Wicki and Wolfgang Staudte, would explore themes of guilt, illusion, and humanity that echoed those nights behind the wire. Wicki, himself a former POW, later directed The Bridge, 1959, a film that carried the same calm fatalism and moral introspection seen in post-war American cinema. In private, many veterans admitted that the first seeds of change were emotional, not ideological. It wasn't the content of the films alone. It was the experience of being treated as human by one's enemy, of being allowed to laugh again. That permission, simple as it seemed, cracked open something deep inside. "I did not believe laughter could exist without cruelty," wrote one former officer in 1947. "Then I saw Americans laugh at themselves, and I understood freedom." Even decades later, in oral histories collected by the German Historical Institute, those memories remained vivid. The smell of popcorn made from cornmeal, the way the guards smiled when Chaplin fell off the ladder, the sound of applause that felt like peace. In a war remembered for brutality and dehumanization, such moments were anomalies, quiet, humane exceptions that refused to vanish. Not everyone welcomed this memory. Some post-war Germans accused returning POWs of being Americanized, detached from their own suffering. But as the Cold War hardened, that very orientation toward the West became invaluable. The men who had seen democracy in practice, even behind barbed wire, helped bridge a cultural divide between conqueror and conquered. The American military, reviewing the entire POW program in 1948, wrote a final, understated assessment: "Respect breeds stability." The treatment of German prisoners on U.S. soil has yielded long-term dividends for peace. That peace, fragile as it was, bore the imprint of thousands of unseen gestures: a shared cigarette, a projector beam, a laugh in the dark. Years later, some of those former prisoners returned as immigrants. By the 1950s and 60s, hundreds applied to settle in the United States, citing fond memories of their captivity. One wrote simply, "I saw your country first from behind wire. It was enough." By then, the world had moved on. The camps were gone, the projectors dismantled, the screens folded away. But the light had left its trace on the minds of men who arrived as enemies and departed as witnesses to a different kind of power. And now, as historians trace that faint beam of influence from a Kansas mess hall to a post-war classroom in Bonn, it leads us to one final question: what did that fragile experiment, born in the heart of war, ultimately teach us about humanity itself? The image is simple: a dark room, a white sheet fluttering in the draft, and on it, the shadows of people who no longer exist. Some wore uniforms marked PW. Others stood guard, watching, unsure whether to pity or to protect. All of them, for a few fragile hours, look toward the same light. The story of German prisoners watching Hollywood films in American camps is not a story about cinema. It is a story about empathy disguised as entertainment. About how, in a war defined by hatred and ideology, a projector beam cut through the darkness with something that resembled mercy. In those makeshift theaters, history performed a quiet experiment. Could the human mind, fed on years of obedience and propaganda, still respond to laughter, music, and the idea of choice? The answer, history suggests, was yes. Not every man was changed. Some remained loyal to the old banners until the end. But many, thousands perhaps more, glimpsed in those films a world where strength did not require cruelty, and patriotism did not demand blindness. They learned, without lectures, that democracy could be imperfect and still just, that freedom could stumble and still rise, that enemies could treat each other decently, not because they were weak, but because they refused to become what they fought. That is the quiet power of civilization. When we imagine World War II, we think of battles, Normandy, Stalingrad, El Alamein. But history also lives in smaller places, in a Kansas mess hall where prisoners laughed at bringing up baby, or in an Alabama camp where a man first saw Mr. Smith, goes to Washington and felt a lump in his throat he could not explain. Those were not victories of armies, but of conscience. Hollywood, for all its glamour and myth, became in that moment something larger, an unintentional envoy of democratic emotion. The stories it told were simple, that every life mattered, that humor survived tragedy, that decency could prevail. For men raised under banners of supremacy and obedience, those ideas were revolutionary, and perhaps that was the lesson the United States never fully recognized at the time, that the most powerful propaganda is not rage, but empathy. The most enduring weapon is not a rifle, but a story. Decades later, many of those prisoners built new lives in a divided Germany. Some joined the West's reconstruction efforts. Some never spoke of the camps again. But their children grew up in a nation that would, eventually, anchor itself to the very ideals once projected before them in the dark. Democracy, individual rights, freedom of thought. That transformation cannot be measured in data or charts. It exists instead in the quiet inheritance of memory, the way a laugh or a melody can outlast ideology. The wire rusted. The screens were folded away. But the idea endured, that even in war, the smallest gestures of humanity leave the deepest mark. Perhaps that is what the guards understood, too, as they stood by those doors, listening to the laughter echo off the walls. They knew these men had fought under a symbol of death, yet here they were, laughing at Cary Grant's clumsiness or Chaplin's chase. For a moment, the enemy was just another audience. In that sense, those screenings were a rehearsal for peace. Not grand peace signed on a battleship, but the quieter kind. Peace that begins when men see each other clearly again. History often celebrates the loud victories, the invasions, the surrenders, the flags raised over ruins. But sometimes the true victories happen in silence, in the hum of a projector, in the shared breath of strangers, in the realization that the world is bigger than the war we made of it. So when we remember World War II, we might pause and picture this instead. A hall in the American heartland, a room full of soldiers far from home, the light flickering, the story unfolding, and for 90 minutes, no sides, no ranks, no borders, only human faces turned toward the screen. That was the war's gentlest miracle. And when the lights came up, perhaps some part of the future, the peaceful, democratic future, was already beginning. History isn't just written in battles and treaties. Sometimes it's written in the quiet moments, when a story on a screen makes an enemy human again. If this film reminded you that compassion can outlast conflict, that even in war humanity finds a way to speak, then help share that light. Subscribe to the channel for more true cinematic stories from history. Stories not of heroes or villains, but of people, choices, and the fragile peace between them. Because remembering how the light reached across the wire is how we keep it alive.